Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Internet weather for May 25th, 2021. We'll start off by looking at scanning activity on the Internet ordered by the top 10 most broad ports. And this is where we look for ports of interest to adversaries. They might be interested in exploitation or new vulnerabilities or new exploits, and we just like to keep an eye on that. So this is data for yesterday. As you could see, all of the ports, if you're a long-time listener of the Internet weather, all of the ports are pretty much the same as what we've highlighted in the past. But one port in particular, we probably haven't paid attention to that much recently, and that's port 2375 TCP. So I'm going to show a few charts I've put together on that port recently, just to explain what the activity is there. The next type of activity that we'll look at is scanning activity on the Internet, but organized instead by the number of IP addresses concurrently scanning for that port, which is coordinated scanning activity. Usually, this indicates some sort of a botnet threat or some sort of maybe a wormable exploit that is out there. And this week, all of the ports that are in the top 10 are ports that we're well familiar with, and probably no need to mention them. The two ports that I would like to mention, however, port 8291 TCP and 8728 TCP are very important ports if you have a MikroTik router. MikroTik routers have management interfaces on these ports. And for many weeks now, we've seen adversaries consistently scanning for this port. And, we've observed previously that once MikroTik routers become compromised, they are then used to host malicious infrastructure and distribute malware. So if you have a MikroTik device, definitely be aware of its configuration and pay attention to make sure that you don't have any administrative interfaces open for your MikroTik router, because there is active exploitation going on. Okay, jumping into the most interesting port this week, 2375 TCP. Decided to look at the last 90 days of activity just to understand what's been happening on it. This represents flows that are observed, that is scanning activity headed towards this port. And we could see that there are, maybe 90 days ago, there were like maybe 10 million flow records per hour of scanning activity headed towards this port. But more recently, there were as many as 160 million or even more flows per hour targeting this port. When we look at this from the perspective of how many IP addresses are engaged in the activity, it's interesting to see a growth pattern over 90 days. So if you look 90 days ago, there were like 100 IP addresses engaged in this behavior. But if you look more recently, there are, anywhere could be between 400 and 700 IP addresses at a time engaged in scanning activity against this port. So you could see this very, very steady rise in the number of IP addresses engaged in this activity. Another way to look at this data is if you take the IP addresses from a previous time frame, like when there were fewer scanners, and map it geographically, and then compare that to more recent activity, you could see that there is something that I would consider a negative trend, which is there are more IP addresses now engaged in the scanning, and they are kind of in similar geographic regions as the previous activity, but more spread out. So to me, this generally indicates a precursor to botnet activity, or definitely some sort of a coordinated interest from multiple different scanners out there for this port. While looking at this, I also noticed that port 2376 TCP had a very similar pattern. It wasn't in the top 10, scanned ports this week. But it is definitely an interesting port because it follows the very same scan patterns. You could see that there are hundreds of millions of scan flows detected recently, whereas 90 days ago there were only maybe tens of millions of flow records. We can also see the same for the scan sources on port 2376 TCP. This slow and steady rise in activity, where maybe 90 days ago there were only 50 IP addresses scanning, and more recently there are like maybe 3, 4, 500 IP addresses scanning for this port. Again, this doesn't indicate a huge botnet or a huge threat, but it does indicate that there are more and more devices out there that are becoming more interested in this port, which generally indicates some sort of bot-like or worm-like behavior on the internet. This might not be like very common, whatever this is, because it is growing so slowly. Taking a look at the distribution geographically, you can see that it's in the same areas as port 2375 TCP, and actually more recently the activity again is spreading in the same regions. Just looking at the IP addresses and seeing the frequency of IP addresses in different regions, it seems that for both 2375 and 2376 TCP, there were a lot of scan sources in Asia that were engaged in this activity. So what is this port, 2375 TCP and 2376 TCP? It's actually related to the Docker REST API. And in 2016, there was a vulnerability that was disclosed in Cisco Cloud Center Orchestrator, Docker engine, where a server would listen on this port publicly. So they would listen on the public interface instead of the local one. And this would allow someone to connect there and potentially launch or create new containers in an unexpected way. Why do bad guys want to know about these Docker instances, perhaps? And why would it be bad to create malicious containers? Well, I think not to give ideas of what adversaries can do, but just to summarize what we've seen done with compromised infrastructure in the past is things that Jim talked about today, where shopping carts are subjected to web shells being injected, or devices turned into malware hosting sites or drop sites. So cryptocurrency mining, things of that nature. There are many ways that adversaries like to use this type of compromised infrastructure to further their illicit activities. Looking at the honeypot, we can see the URI patterns that are most frequently visited by devices that are scanning on port 2375 TCP or 2376 TCP. You can see them right there. If you look at the honeypot chart, you could also see the growth in the number of IP addresses scanning over time for this port, and a little bit of a reference there to the original Cisco Cloud Center blog in 2016.
And this got me interested, so I went and looked at my own honeypots, and I looked at the Internet Storm Center's graph of activity on these two ports for the last year rather than just 90 days. And I was interested to see what Stan has up on the screen here now, that we're actually just now getting back to about where the traffic was a year ago, or June, July, into the beginning of August last year. There was actually a lot more scanning on both the 2375 and 2376 graphs are almost identical. So we got the 2376 here. In this case, the black is the number of targets, the number of different IPs that were targeted, and the green is the number of machines doing the scanning. So we do see exactly what you just showed, that increase over the last 90 days or so in the number doing the scanning, but the number of targets being scanned is now just getting back to where we were a year ago. And I don't remember any particular new vulnerability a year ago, but there was a lot of scanning, and then it just kind of dropped off for, 6 months or so. So I'm wondering if the attackers know something that we don't, or if they're just, going back after these Docker instances that haven't been secured. Yeah.
You know what I find interesting about it, Jim, is the vulnerability is from 2016, and looking at it this year back kind of makes sense, because it's unlikely that the adversaries would have just in the past 90 days started targeting. I really like this year back chart, because it does show that the activity existed, dropped off, and then there's regained interest in it. One change I see that I think is very important is that when the activity was high in June and the summer of last year, the number of sources was not growing.
Right.
But if you look in the last 90 days, it is interesting that the number of sources is growing. And I think you have a very valid point, which is the adversaries might know something new now that has maybe allowing them to recruit or infect maybe more devices out there potentially. We'll definitely take a closer look at it.
Yeah, I think this is definitely one we need to keep an eye on over the coming, weeks, the next month or two, and see. That's why I love the internet weather, though. We get to see these things as they're starting, sometimes even before the vulnerabilities are made public. We can see some of that activity in looking at the traffic that we see on the internet. So
it is amazing what we can learn just by looking a little bit harder. But it's always a puzzle to solve because we have just enough and not enough information at the same time. Thanks for pointing this out, Jim. I think this is really insightful, especially seeing that increase in the number of scan sources in the last 90 days. This is definitely one to watch out for. And with that, I'd like to conclude the internet weather for this week. If you have any comments or suggestions for ports that we should investigate, or if you have any additional information about these ports or maybe the vulnerability or exploit that's being used, please feel free to reach out and drop a comment in the video below. Thank you, everyone.